to the Kemetic How-To Guide for Egyptian Pagan and Kemetic practitioners. I'm your host, Sharon. Today I want to talk a little bit about the role of Isis in classical Egypt, or what they call Pharaonic Egypt. This is the time period before the Greeks and Romans came in. Just so you know, there's a couple things I need to point out. For one, you heard me say Isis. A lot of people will call her Aset. I've also heard Ost, Oset, I think I'm saying that right. Isi, there's so many different variations on her name, but we all know Isis is referring to this lady right here. So I'm going to stick with that for simplicity's sake. Now I have a section on Isis in my book, Following the Sun, and you can see her section, and this is a bookmark that I made. Here we go, you can see her picture, and she's got all of this in another page devoted just to her. So if you want to learn more about her, this is one way you can. Now today we know of her as a mother goddess. That's the role that sticks out in everyone's mind. What's interesting is the role of the Great Mother, the Mother Goddess, however you want to put it, was shared by several other goddesses throughout Egyptian history. In the very early part of their history, it was Neith, and then later on it was Hathor, and then later on Isis sort of took the role over from Hathor. In fact, the horns with the sun disk that she's wearing originally came from Hathor. And one of her titles was also Uret Hakau, which means Great of Magic. She worked magic to protect children. There are papyrus that have spells for curing scorpion stings and other things like that, and it stresses the role of Isis to protect her son Horus. So she did have a mothering role even in ancient times, but she also had roles in magic. She would fight Apophis in the underworld along with Serket, who is in some accounts her daughter. And she also embodied the succession from one generation to the next. If you think about this image here, she's protecting the next king, who was engendered by the previous king, who was her husband. So she was seen as a protector and a continuer of the throne. In fact, one of the hieroglyphs that spells her name is a throne. So she had a lot of different roles. What's interesting to me is that she really increased in popularity in Egypt as the country started to decline, because after the Ramesside era, when you had a series of kings named Ramesses, Egypt went through sort of a depression. You had bad harvests one year, there were famines, some of the tomb workers went on strike because they weren't getting paid, then they had to fight off foreign invasions, so things were really not looking very good for them. And if you think about Isis's story, she ended up a single mother, had to raise her son in hiding in the marshes. So a lot of people could kind of relate to the struggle that she went through. And the Greeks and Romans really picked up on this when they came in. Some of that may have been because their goddesses may not have had such strong roles as Isis. In fact, I would invite anyone who's a Hellenistic pagan to respond and give their input on that, and tell us a little bit more about their goddesses. But the Greeks and Romans really picked up on Isis. Of course, at this point, Isis was already absorbing different roles from other native Egyptian deities, such as Neith and Hathor and perhaps even Bast. And so the Greeks and Romans came in, and most of what they saw was directed toward Isis. And devotion to Isis gradually spread throughout the Mediterranean region. A really good book that's referred to in several other books about Isis, such as Mysteries of Isis and probably Circle of Isis as well, would be a book called The Golden Ass. This is actually the first novel in Western literature. It was written by a Roman author named Apuleius, and you can find translations of it for free online. It tells the story about a Greek kid named Lucius who gets himself into a lot of trouble. He ends up getting himself changed into a donkey, and he goes through a lot of different misadventures trying to get himself turned back to normal. What finally gets him turned back to normal is when he has a vision of Isis. And the epithet Isis of 10,000 names comes from the Golden Ass. And it describes his vision of Isis, and then the festival, the procession of Isis, that he kind of gets into the middle of, and that's how he's finally cured and turned back into a human. And he becomes an initiate of Isis at the end of the story. So a lot of people have referred to that. It's very interesting to read. Again, find it online. Skim through all the rest of it. There's a few naughty stories in there if you want to read those. And then it describes in the last couple of chapters his encounter with Isis. And of course, we all know how Isis ended up providing sort of a prototype for the Madonna and Child. If you think about it, in the Roman Mediterranean world, you had the new religion of Christianity, and then you had the spreading cult of Isis. Note that I say cult in the academic sense, not, like the negative connotation of cult. Anyway, you had the cult of Isis spread and then Christianity, both at the same time, and so it's only logical that you'd have a little bit of transposition. What's interesting is Isis had a role as mistress of the seas, and there is an aspect of Mary, or title of Mary, as Queen of the Waves. There's even an old song in Catholic tradition devoted to Mary, Queen of the Waves. And I've seen statues of Mary wearing the blue robes and the crown, holding her son, Jesus, sort of like Isis would be holding Horus, and holding a hand out to calm the waves. This could have been a direct transposition of a role of Isis. Now, personally, I don't work with Isis as closely as I do with Hathor and other deities such as Sekhmet. And incidentally, I don't think Hathor and Sekhmet are the same goddess. But I do pay respect to her at periods that are appropriate, especially at certain festivals, which I also talk about in the book. I have to plug it. But that's why she's part of my main altar that I have in another room. Hopefully this will give you a little bit more insight for your own practice. For the Kemetic How-To Guide, this is Sharon, wishing you Synapti.